All right, here we go. So last year I decided I wanted to buy a new amp to practice with, a practice amp. And I looked at a lot of stuff. I wanted something small. I wanted something that sounded good. I wanted something tube. I wanted something fairly traditional. So I decided on a Fender Princeton, one of the 65 Princetons at first. Fender's been doing the Princeton since the 40s, the late 40s, but the modern version since the early 1960s. In 2008, they did a reissue of the 65 Princeton. It's a blackface reissue. It's a circuit board amp, but it's all tube. They're really cool. And I thought, well, I'll get one of those. Early last year in January at the NAMM show, Fender introduced, though, an addition to their hand-wired series, their custom hand-wired series. They added a 64 Princeton to that, which is a blackface circuit. It's similar to the 65, but this is a hand-wired version. The circuit's slightly different. That one has a different speaker in it. Instead of a ceramic Jensen, it's got a Alnico Jensen in it. But anyway, really cool amp, but it's more than double the price. They're quite expensive. So I thought, well, this is just something I'm going to be practicing with. They're expensive. Talked myself into the 65 Princeton, decided to go ahead and get that. And so this is like late summer, early fall. And so I looked around online. If you remember last year, even now, I haven't looked recently, but there are times when it's hard to find anything in stock, and these amps are no different. But I found a retailer online, not one of the real big retailers, but a retailer online that has 65 Princeton in stock. And I called, and they gave me a little discount on the amp, so I ordered it, and they shipped it here, and that was great. So when I opened the amp up, I pulled it out, turned it on, plugged the guitar in. It was great. I was happy. It sounded great. Played around with the amp. I'd had it a little while. I noticed that there was a little dent in the front of the amp, on the front faceplate. You could see it sort of in the light, when the light would catch it a certain way. It didn't appear to affect the performance of the amp, but the way that these amps are made, the 65, there's a circuit board that the knobs are on, the pots are on, that sits right behind the faceplate, right? So the knobs stick through like this. It's a circuit board on the back of it that's all wired together. And you really don't want that thing flexing like this, right? You could break a contact. It's just not good for the board. You don't want to be flexing those. And that dent was in a place that if it was actually denting the chassis of the amp, it could be flexing the board, putting some pressure on that board. It was hard to tell. There's sort of a facade faceplate on the front, that black faceplate that says Princeton, and the chassis, it sort of sits on the chassis. I couldn't tell if it was just the faceplate that was dented. Anyway, I called the retailer and told him about it. And I said, look, I've been working with equipment my whole life. I can pull this apart and take a look at it and see what it looks like inside. If it's just the faceplate, maybe I can bend it back and keep the amp. He said, go ahead, take it apart and look at it. And I did. I took some pictures of it. It was actually the chassis that was bent. So that made me a little uncomfortable. It's a new amp. This is a commodity. They're not hard to get. It's not like a vintage amp. So I called the retailer back and said, look, I want to return this. I don't want to keep this one. So I did. And he didn't have another one to send me, so I kept looking. And so a couple of weeks go by. Late one afternoon, I'm sitting around, and I thought, I'm going to look and just see if I can get a deal on a 64. And nobody had them in stock then. This is like early fall last year. And so I wound up calling Musician's Friend. They had some listed in stock, and I called. And I talked to a guy there on the phone. He said, "Yeah, we got some of them." And I asked about a discount, and he said, "Well, I can't really do that, but we're part of Guitar Center," which I knew. He said, if you call back, I also work for Guitar Center, and if you call back on the Guitar Center number, then I can give you a discount. So I did. I called back, and he gave me a discount, and they sent the amp out, and it was great, right? So I wait a week or so, and the amp comes in. And so as soon as I brought it in and looked at it, I could tell it had been repacked. It wasn't factory packed from Fender. And you can tell because Fender have these copper staples on their boxes. They're not sort of taped up. And this had been ripped open and retaped. And the other way you can tell if you open one is because the amps are actually shipped upside down. And I guess that's to keep the tubes like this, when it's shipping instead of up. And maybe, I can't think of another reason why they would do that, but they're shipped upside down, and there's a label on the top of the box that says to turn over and open it. Anyway, but when people repack them, I guess they don't think about that, and they just pack them right side up. So it was packed upside down too. So I pulled the amp out, and I could tell, well, you could look at it, there was dust all over it. It had clearly been out for a while. This didn't just come out of the box and go back in. So it had looked like it had been sitting around. So I plugged it in and turned it on, plugged the guitar in, and as soon as the tubes warm up and I strum a couple of chords, and it sounds like you would expect, And maybe after about 10 or 12 seconds, though, it starts making this horrible noise, right? This loud hum. It's like if you turn a guitar amp on 10 and then touch your finger to the cable. You know what that sounds like? That's what this sounded like. It was so loud. So I pulled the cord out of the amp. My first thought was, is it something with the cord? Is it the guitar? But it kept making the noise. So the volume control in the amp didn't do anything. It was just there. And so I turned the amp off and I let it cool off and I tried it again and it continued to do that. So my first thought was, well, it's probably a bad tube. Because when you have a tube amp, especially a new tube amp and it's having problems, the first thing to think is always probably there's wrong with the tube, or probably there is something wrong with the tube. So I had another 12AX7 here. So the Princetons have three 12AX7s, a 12AT7, and two 6L6s, and then a rectifier tube. So I pulled the first preamp tube out, V1, which is the first preamp tube, and put another 12AX7 in. These are groove tubes that were some sort of rebranded as the Xing something, the Chinese tube manufacturer. And those are fine. There's nothing wrong with those tubes. They're all about the same now. But anyway, so I had a JJ tube here. I popped that in, turned it back on. Amp was fine, right? So it was a tube. It was the V1 tube that was causing the problem. So the amp appeared to work after that. Now I'll say this, I didn't notice this right away. I had the amp, a day or so, but when you would turn it on for the first, 5 or 10 minutes after it was on, it would still in the background make this faint rustling sound. It wasn't noticeable like if there was other noise, but you could hear it. And I thought, well, that's probably another tube. I didn't have any other tubes to swap out. I didn't have any 6L6s either to test the power tubes. So anyway, I called Guitar Center and I talked to them and they said, well, what probably happened, we've got a warehouse where we have new stuff, and when people order stuff online, if it's new, we just ship it out of the warehouse, but if we don't have one, then we'll pull one from a store. And this must have got pulled from a store somewhere because we didn't have one in the warehouse to send. Okay, I guess that's okay. I mean, if you go to a Guitar Center and buy something, you might buy the one off the floor, maybe ask for a discount. I'd gotten a little discount on the amp. I remember back in the day when you go to brick and mortar mom and pop stores, and if you went to buy a guitar, you bought the one that was on the shelf. They didn't have 20 of them in the back to bring you a new one out of the box. It's just the way you did it. So I was okay with that. The amp looked okay. It was dusty, but it didn't appear to have any physical damage. It's been well cared for on the floor. So, and also I called Fender and I told them about this tube issue. And at first they wanted to send me to a Fender service center, but the closest one to us is like 45 minutes or an hour away. And so I'm gonna have to make 2 trips, drop the thing off and go pick it back up and kill a day doing this. And I said, look, that's crazy, Anyway, they agreed to just send me a whole set of tubes. Fender's really cool. They've got a good customer support, and none of the things that I'm talking about are an issue with Fender. And they did. They sent me a whole set of tubes, 3 12AX7s, a 12AT7, and 2 6L6s. So I was happy. I called Guitar Center back. Talked to them and decided, I'll just keep the amp because I talked to them about maybe sending it back. Anyway, this is a week or so has gone by at this point, maybe 10 days, and I still had the amp box here in my office. I hadn't taken it out yet, and it's one evening, late in the evening, 10 o'clock at night maybe, and I'm in my office, I look at the box and I think it's sort of a ceremonial thing. I'm going to go ahead and take the box to the garage because I'm keeping the amp now. And when I picked the box up, I hadn't noticed this before, but it caught, I guess just the light or whatever, or I hadn't turned it around and looked at it that closely. But there's a shipping label, these white shipping labels that are on the box, right? And that's what they put on for shipping. So there was the one shipped to me, but there was another one on the box also. And there was a white sticker over that to sort of cover it up, to mask the original sticker. But you could see through it, like you can see through an envelope if you hold it up in the light. And I could see that there was another name and address on the label. And I thought, was this shipped out to somebody else? So anyway, it's late. I didn't know what to do with that. So I went to bed. Anyway, I got up the next day and I'd been thinking about it that morning. And so I decided to Google the name and the address on the box. And actually some phone numbers popped up, right? Oh, and by the way, I'm on the East Coast, all the way on the East Coast, and this address where this had been shipped was in Oakland, California, so like a continent apart, right? I Google the address, some phone numbers come up, and it was not any of these sites where you have to put your credit card in or anything. Like they normally will pop up and say, oh yeah, we can give you all this information, just sign up for an account. It just showed some phone numbers. So I didn't do anything then, but when I got home that night, I decided to call the phone number, the first one. And the guy on the box actually answered the phone. He was in line. He lives in California. He was in line at a Starbucks to get a coffee. And so I started talking to him. I told him, I told him who I was, and asked him if he had bought a 64 Princeton amp. And so he starts telling me he bought this amp back in, so this is like fall, like October. when I'm calling him of last year. He said he'd bought this amp back in the spring. Guitar Center had a deal where you could, and he ordered it online, you could buy something, you could keep it for 6 months and take it back anytime before that, and they gave you a year to pay for it. So he did that and he bought this amp. So he gets the amp, he's making payments on it. At some point while he's got it, he's thinking, does this make sense for me? Is this a great financial decision? I think maybe something had happened. But so he comes home one day, so he's already thinking, maybe I should take the amp back. This is like almost 6 months. He's almost up on his time to take it back. He said he came home one day, turned it on, and it started making this horrible noise, the same one I described, right? So he couldn't even play the amp, and he didn't know what was wrong with it. So he said, well, that's it. That's a sign I'm taking it back. So Guitar Center, if you order online, you can return to a local store. So that's what he did. He took it back to the store that was either in Oakland or near Oakland. It was the one closest to him, the one that shipped it out to me. And he actually only taken it back about like a week before they sent it out to me. So they hadn't had it for that long. It got shipped out to me pretty quick. You know, they sent me a used amp, basically. But here's the crazy thing. So when I'm talking to him, he says, what'd you say your name was again? And I told him. He said, listen, I know you. I used to live in the same town you're in, and you used to give my brother bass guitar lessons like 20 years ago. And he told me who his brother was, and I actually remember the kid who is an adult now. And he later, this person I'm talking to later texted me a picture. We texted a picture of him playing a guitar that he bought at the music store that I worked at. So anyway, it's crazy. What a small world. How many of these amps does Fender make? And he and I wound up with the same amp. We used to know each other. We lived in the same town. I gave his brother lessons. He bought a guitar at the music store I'm in. And now we're a continent apart. It's just kind of nuts, really. Anyway, so I get off the phone with him. He was really cool. And now I'm pretty annoyed. So I called Guitar Center back, and I wound up talking to somebody at management, and I tell the guy what happened, and he's like, I'm sorry about that. And he said, I can't believe we're sending out boxes with other customers' names and addresses on them. And so I talked to him, and he said you can send it back, but he actually agreed to give me another discount and send me a set of tubes. So now with the first discount and the second one, I'm getting the amp for about what's cost for them, and 2 complete sets of tubes for it. One from Fender that they've already have sent me that's on the way, and Guitar Center is going to send me one. So, so I said, well, that's fine. I'll just keep the amp, I guess, which I did, and haven't had any issues with it. Actually, the other tubes, the 6 L6s were bad. I had to replace those. That was the cause of the rustling noise. And the other 2 12AX7s and the 12AT7 have been replaced too. All of them have started making noises at some point. So it's got a full set of new tubes in it now, and I have extra tubes because of the other set that was sent to me. But yeah, so what a crazy story, right? So, this kid and I, who I knew all those years ago and knew his brother, we wound up with the same amp. But yeah, what about Guitar Center? Oh, there's one more thing too. This is, so the Guitar Center supervisor that I'm talking to, I asked him which store this came out of, and he tells me the name of the store, gives me the phone number. So when I got off the phone with him, I called the store and I talked to the supervisor there, the manager, and I think his name was Jonathan. This is like back in October of last year. It may not have been, but I think that was the name. And I explained to him what had happened, and he was confused at first, and he finally figured out what I was talking about. It seemed a little bit annoyed that I was calling him and bothering him. And I said, well, look, because the amp was making that noise before they sent it out, because it was making that noise whenever this guy took it back, right? It was unplayable. This wasn't a minor noise. This was like all you could hear. It was like the amp at full volume, like humming. And I said, didn't you test this amp when it came back in? He told me that when a customer brings something back to return it, unless the customer tells them that there's a problem, then they don't test stuff. They just put it back out and sell it. And I said, well, this amp has been out for 6 months. This is a used amp at this point. And this is not like a guitar cable. This is an amp that's over $2,000. No, we don't test them. So, yeah. So listen, Guitar Center, who probably will never watch this video, 1, just don't send used amps out to people as new. And 2, when you get stuff back in, just plug it in and test it and make sure it works before you sell it to somebody else. But listen, Fender was great. They did all they could do. None of this is their fault. I love the amp. So, and their customer support's always been great. Guitar Center, they treated me right, really, after selling me a used amp. Anyway, they gave me the amp. I got the amp at a very good price, and I got another set of tubes from them. So, all sort of worked out in the end. But what a crazy experience. And if the amp hadn't been making that humming noise, I never would have known about any of this. So, good luck out there when you're shopping. And thanks for listening to the story. It's just kind of cool. So anyway, take care.